All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest edition of X Factor, brought to you by Private Equity CXO, the world's largest digital community for private equity executives, with a mission of ensuring their success through content, connections, and a variety of resources. And here on X Factor, what we like to do is visit with a subject matter expert in a certain topic of particular interest to them and go deep in a real pragmatic way that allows our wonderful audience out there to take advantage and hopefully make your jobs easier, better, faster, stronger. I'm your host, Rob Huxtable. I'm a partner with Falcon, a retained executive search firm that does exclusive search work for PE-backed mid-market companies, where we focus on CEOs, CFO, and chief revenue officers. And my guest today is Jeff Ralyea. Jeff and I go back a bit, and he's a highly accomplished executive who's got a private equity-backed CEO exit under his belt, among other accomplishments. But what makes Jeff unique is he's sort of gone into business for himself as a outside board director and private equity consultant, where he sits on the boards of 6 different portfolio companies spanning multiple private equity firms. And for a couple of those assignments, he's the executive chair. And for other assignments, he's a standard outside board director. So he's got a really unique vantage point of how private equity firms create value. And what we're going to uncover with Jeff is how executives can best optimize that quarterly board meeting from a prep, reporting, deck creation, and engagement standpoint that can turn this thing from an event you have to survive to a positive opportunity to create value and engage with your board. So Jeff, thank you so much. Welcome, and really happy to have you.
Thanks, Rob. Really excited to be here and looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I thought we could start higher level and kind of understand the players involved here with this whole equation. So just give us your sense of your typical board makeup and what is on the minds of these folks as they think about engaging with management, specifically at that quarterly board meeting interval.
Yeah, in a typical board that's where a business is owned by that private equity firm, you're going to have a makeup of always in the room are going to be from the business, the CEO and the CFO, and we'll talk about who some other players could or should be. But then from that private equity firm, you're always going to have whoever the partner or the principal that was on the deal that actually brought the deal to the investment committee, and underwrote the thesis. They may or may not have a operating partner, somebody that really doesn't come from a finance or investment background, but maybe more from an operational background. They would have somebody like that. They typically will have another member of the investment team that could be an associate, could be another principal, but somebody else that's doing additional work. And then you're almost always going to have 1 to 2, maybe 3 outside advisors that are typically focused in a very specific area. So if the product roadmap was a key value creation, then they might bring somebody out of industry that's got a lot of product and technology background. If go-to-market was the key value driver, you might find somebody that was, a highly successful CRO. And that is, part of the challenge is you've got all of this diversity on your board around backgrounds and what their interests are in how they think about success. And you're going to have to create material and present material that's going to resonate with all of that cadre of people that are showing up all the time with questions.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think as you and I were prepping for today's conversation, another stakeholder could be the founder of the business, depending on where that deal is in its history. And that's a whole different dynamic of emotions and engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. You wind up with a founder on the board, and they're an amazing resource for you. A lot of times you're stepping in as that CEO, and you're, replacing that founder who's, taking the opportunity with their exit to step maybe into some other passion pursuit that they have. but we never have to forget that that founder built that business, right? And so they have things that will always be on their mind that, you know, you're going to need to deal with. So it's just, you're right, an absolute another personality that's in the room.
Yeah, good deal. And so I think my experience is it's a little bit more natural for executives to relate to and understand outside board directors who are coming from industry and are also operators themselves. I thought we could unpack, though, the makeup of the investors from the private equity firm itself, who, you know, and I say this with great respect, hyper intellectual, highly analytical, extremely logic based, models oriented. And, you know, if something can make sense in a spreadsheet, very often they're going to want to see that manifest in the reality of the business, even if it doesn't always take into full account some of the context of the challenge. But just kind of talk through who that audience is and what they're most focused on as they enter board season.
Yeah, you know, as a private equity investment teams, you know, looks at a business, you know, and you hit on some of the key attributes, right? I mean, just very intellectual, very smart, data driven. They can consume volumes of material very, very quickly. And what I always find interesting on that is they're not great email readers. In other words, right, when you send an email, it's got to be concise. Like, what was the one thing that you wanted them to take away? But when you're putting material together, it's kind of the opposite. It's you want a readable board deck, but you need all of the data behind that board deck, and you want to make it relatively easy for them. So, you know, call outs, footnotes, right? As an example, if you've got a detailed deferred revenue bridge in your appendix, it's probably there because you're going to refer to it somewhere earlier in the deck. So don't make it hard for them to go find it. And also, right, don't leave the question unsaid. It's like, hey, if you know that you've already answered a question, footnote it, call it out, tell them where to go get it in the data packet that you've provided. So you got to remember that from a private equity perspective, they get first they get a teaser, then they get a sim, then they get a data room, and they are consuming all of that data. And they actually put together their own material that then they present to an investment committee. That material that they present becomes kind of ironclad. Like, that's what they're going to go back and update the investment committee about. So what we want to do in preparing our board material is we want to be closely aligned with how do we prepare material that allows the board to easily update their constituents up the line. Because it's not just that there's the investment committee, but there's, you know, usually beyond the investment committee, there's a once a year LP meeting, right? And investor fund level, where they also give updates on the business. So that material is going to get used and reused over and over again. And so we want to make sure that we're preparing a very well thought out deck that answers lots and lots of detailed questions.
Yeah, no doubt. And is it fair to say that the further up that chain you go, from management to board to investment committee to LPs, the less interested they are in all the nuance and extraneous information, and the more focused they become on, well, what does this mean for MOIC and IRR?
That's exactly right. Right. So, you know, because if you go back down, and when an LP invests in a fund, they're presented a likely outcome on MOIC, right? They're like, you're going to put in, you know, $20 million and we're going to return to you $80 million over 4 years, right? And then when we present a investment opportunity to the IC, we're doing the same thing, right? We're going to craft a deck that says, through these value creation initiatives, we're going to take this business from 25 million in recurring revenue to 100 million in recurring revenue, add an extra 15, basis points of EBITDA, and we're going to get a, 3 to 5x return on the invested capital. And so as we're building out board decks and as we're thinking about how we're presenting the business, we have to present the business back almost exactly that way. Like, how are we achieving all of those growth initiatives? And if we're not achieving them, then what are the tangible activities that we're measuring? And, and what's that measurement cadence going to look like? And that'll, I think we'll circle back to this, but that gets at what should you be reporting and talking about outside of your quarterly board meetings?
Yeah. And you and I talked in our prep about no matter how busy you've been or how many things you've accomplished throughout the quarter, it's almost irrelevant if it's not covered by the umbrella of what the investors actually care about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's spot on. I think almost all new management teams, as they're getting better at reporting to their board, go through a cycle of they want the board to know how busy they are. Like everybody's busy, everybody's working hard, we're putting in all of the hours. And I think what's interesting is a board would be just as happy or probably even more happy if all the results were being met and everybody was just working a reasonable number of hours, right? So it's not about how busy you are or how hard you are. It's about, are you producing the results? And if you're not producing the results, then what are we precisely doing about that? And when do we expect to see improvement on the results that we're not actually achieving? That's what a board's really going to care about. Because I think you and I also touched on this. I think too often leadership teams struggle a little bit with kind of the like affirmation. Am I getting affirmed that all the work I'm doing and the energy I'm putting in, is it being valued? And I think that's why we want to present ourselves as, man, we are working super hard and we're really trying to figure this out. But I actually think that in a lot of ways, what the board is going to recognize is you are working hard. That's the assumption, right? That everybody's really working hard. But tell me what's not working. And I think a lot of leadership teams pivot the other way. They want to talk about they're working hard and we've got really good results over here. And then they wait for the board to bring up the bad things. And you've got to go just the opposite. It's when you get into a board update, whether it's a quarterly update, and it really, bad news should never be once a quarter, right? Or you're doing monthly updates, or honestly, when things aren't going exactly the way that you thought and there's bad news happening, you want to get that into a cadence where you're letting the board know that you're on top of that. Because all of us are human and we just make assumptions about things. And if I get into a board meeting and it's the first time that I've heard that lead generation is down by 30%, or our win rate is off by 20% of expectation, or we lost 2 of our biggest accounts, I get worried that there's a lot more negative that I don't really know about. But if you're keeping me up to date all the way along with, right, pertinent, right, transparent updates, right, then when I get into the board meeting, you can present I've already updated you guys throughout the quarter on this is what we've been challenged with. Here's what we've been doing about it. And here's how we've already seen change. And this is additional what we're going to do about it. I think that's the other thing is, you need to be transparent about the bad as early and as often as you really have to be.
Yeah, I've heard it said countless times, good news fast, bad news faster. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that private equity boards want to know that management is thinking about the business the way that they're thinking about the business, in addition to the operating consequences and so forth. And therefore, we're disciplined in what we're doing. So ironically, the busier you are and the more you report out about that, the more that any of that activity is outside the boundary of direct line of sight to the investment thesis, the more trouble you might be in. The more you convey bad news ahead of time, the more trust you're actually building. And they spend less time sort of hunting and cross-examining and more time sort of helping. But as you pointed out, it kind of goes against the grain of human nature to lean into some of those courageous communication behaviors.
Exactly. And I think one way that, I advise all of the businesses that I work with, the CEO and CFO in particular, because, what I find is, they're very easy to guide and advise. And then there's another level, right, after them that, your CTOs and your CMOs and your CROs and whatnot. And what I really advise that leadership team to do on a monthly basis is to get together and basically produce the board report, but for yourself. Like, start improving and building that and presenting it to yourselves, present it to each other and learn from it and improve it constantly, right? It's just each month you're going to constantly improve that, because if you're evaluating all of those core metrics And then the CEO and the CFO get to act as a very small micro board, right? But it's not just about having the material built, right? It's, are they learning how to present appropriately, not how busy they are, not the tactical, this is what we did, but the actual measurable, this is what mattered, right? If we can get beyond what we did and only focus on, here's what we've measured, and here's, transparently what we're not happy with and what we're doing about it and what we expect in the next update, right? To be able to give you a better picture of, everybody's going to get a lot better when we actually get in a board meeting and present that material, because you're constantly practicing on, how to present the business the right way. And that's important, because I think it is important that a CEO involve a fair amount of their leadership team. And a big reason for that is because the CEO is a little bit of an island, and we want that CEO to have other people looking at that leadership team and being able to give them feedback and commentary on that leadership team. And, your board updates are a great way to do that. And you may not have somebody that's board ready from a presentation perspective. It makes total sense that you might not include that person. But you want to be training them up. And the only way you can do that is if you actually get them into a cadence where they're reporting the business to you as the CEO or the CFO, and you're challenging them to constantly improve on their understanding of their part of the business.
Yeah, boy, that framework that I'll lazily call the three whats: what we're not happy with, what we're doing about it, and what we anticipate we can all see in terms of improvement, is, I think, at the core of how your board is wired. So that's great insight. When you think of transitioning more toward board prep and then the materials, what is the essence of a good board meeting? What should it really be about, and what should it not be about?
Yeah, I mentioned the one that it really shouldn't be about your activity or the busyness of your team or how many tactical items they got done in a quarter. It's got to be about, measurable, numbers that, and I always look at it as that board material ought to be line of sight to what your exit material looks like. So, right. And you really want to report on a fulsome business. So, you want to start with, maybe your people and talk about the key metrics on, are you retaining your employees? And if you're not, why? Like, where are they going and what are you doing about it? So if you've got a culture problem, are you fixing your culture problem? But so it's the, right, in employees, also diversity, right, and inclusion. Where do you sit on those metrics, and what are you doing about those? I think that, for me, I always look at customer health as the next, in a software industry in particular, which is my background, because, one of the most important measures of a software company is going to be its customer retention, right? Both at a logo level, a gross dollars level, and then a net level. And that's the core. If I always look at it as like the core health of a stable business. Are you getting those metrics, and are those metrics aligned to what the investment thesis said, right? Because that's the thing, is if the investment thesis said, hey, you guys were already good at 92%, but we thought we were going to take it up by 4% up to 96. Are you tracking that way or not on the gross retention number? And then I think you get into, right, your just core financials, right? And I think there's, that's a pretty standard deck, but I think I've seen where they go to present core financials, but they don't have really good call outs and they don't have a good appendix in the background. Because honestly, that's what the private equity firm is going to go deep on right away, is they're going to look at all of those financials. They're going to focus in on them. They're going to look at all of the OpEx levers. They're going to look at, gross margin. They're going to look at operating margin. They want to know that you guys have that nailed down. And then I think, I've never seen an investment thesis that didn't have go-to-market as a core value driver, and I think that's the one where most businesses struggle, because it's, are you able to really articulate what's going well from a go-to-market perspective and what's not, and are you at a detailed enough level that if you're using, like a multi-channel model where you use, some, sales pods, and then you have an enterprise partner or enterprise executives, and then you have a partner community, and then you got a reseller community. Are you measuring all of them? Because you should be, right? And which ones are working well and which ones aren't? And what are you doing about, if the ones that are working well, can you get more juice out of that? The ones that aren't working well, do you really know why it's not working well, or do you just know it's not working? Because that's, the board's going to key in on those things. And I think that's the key, and then, obviously there's marketing, and then there's product, and then there's professional services. There's a fulsome report out that has to happen, because all of those things tie back to the value that the business is ultimately going to get sold on. And I can guarantee that in all of those areas, there are objectives that were in the original investment thesis, that the board is thinking about and returning to identify, are we tracking against those things or not?
Yeah, no doubt. So when you think about reporting out, and obviously with a slightly broader audience of a couple outside board directors and a founder, they may not be on the phone with you weekly. They may not be in the monthly operating reviews. So for them, some of this may be the first time they're consuming level information at this detail. Going back to the investors, the MD or the partner, how much information, if any, should be new to them? Or is it information you've already communicated throughout the quarter, and this is kind of an unpacking of the data behind it?
Yeah, I think it's predominantly a validation and a further level of detail of what they've already heard. So I encourage all of my leadership teams to create a monthly flash at the beginning of the month. That's basically going to include things like, what did you book last month, right, against budget? What did that look like then from top line revenue coming in? What are you estimating your expenses are going to look like? In other words, did you have anything that was up or down substantially that you can call out in that moment that is going to alter your forecast? And I asked for that on, the second day of the business, right? Second business day of the month. And that's, they need more time to be able to put together the fulsome forecast, but they can make those call outs to basically say, hey, here's how we kind of perform from a sales perspective against objectives and budget. And this is what we're kind of seeing on how that's going to impact us when we put together the forecast that's going to come 8 or 9 days later. And here's what we're calling for the current month. This is what we actually think we're going to do in the current month. And then if there's a part of the business that we're struggling with, maybe it's services and services utilization and profitability, then we want that as a special call out. Like, this is what we said we were going to be doing. And this is, how we're, working against that from an achievement perspective. Could be pipeline development that they need to see. But I honestly think that, you get into that, that monthly flash that says, here's what we're going to do. And then you put the forecast out, a week or two after that. And you need to be doing that monthly forecast as much for the board as for your internal leadership. Like, your leadership needs to know, because if you get 5 months into a year and you've missed your bookings number by 20%, then you as a leadership team are going to have to answer back to the board, what are you doing to manage your COGS and your OPEX so that you stay in alignment from a final margin perspective and EBITDA perspective, right? And if you're not doing your forecast, then you as a leadership team aren't talking about that, because you're not seeing, right, what the future is actually going to look like. So, so to me, there's that monthly flash, then there's the actual forecast. And then internally, like I mentioned, I encourage the leadership team to get together and do a deep monthly operating review based on that forecast and, and what they expect to be doing going forward, and then obviously achieving.
Yeah. So it sounds like leading up to the board meeting, the dialogue has been continuous. The flash reporting and the forecasting has been continuous. There should be no real surprises in the board materials that haven't been sort of anticipated or forecasted. And then you have the opportunities, you and I were talking in prep, to kind of step back and consider, okay, who are the cast of characters on our board? Where do they like to go deep? And we're going to get some pattern recognition over a certain number of quarters. And how can we best anticipate all the right questions broadly and specifically to those that tend to want to dig in? And how can we build that into the deck, footnotes, appendices, et cetera?
Spot on. I think, that cast of people that are going to be in that room, some of which may be a founder, maybe an outside advisor, could be the MD or the partner, the principal on the deal. Usually they're bringing in some associates, right, that are crunching numbers before that because they're going to get the material beforehand. And we haven't talked about that, but we'll come back to it. But you need to learn every single time you actually present to the board. You need to begin to understand where your board goes deep, what really matters to them. I'll use an example. I won't name any names, but I've got one principal on a company that every single board update, and it doesn't matter. It could, we could have talked about this a week before, but if we get in another update call and the deferred revenue number comes up on a slide, this person's going to ask why the deferred revenue number is different than the budget. And in this particular case, it's just because the budget wasn't built using a detailed customer model. It was built using a forecast model. And that was a mistake at the budget level, but the answer is identical every single time. Well, we're just not footnoting it. So, the principal's, working across a large portfolio. So he just sees a big miss and he wants to understand it. And sometimes the miss is to the bad. Sometimes the miss is to the good, but the question's always the same. Mm-hmm. And so it's a perfect example of that person's always going to ask that question. Just answer the question on the slide. Just put it in there. Simple footnote actually, allows us to move forward on that, and so I do think that the whole idea of evolving board material is if there was a question asked, you should have captured that. And then in the next material update, that question's already answered. You came back and you answered it. And that's where your monthly forecast and your monthly operating review really benefit you, because you're able every month to make that reporting package improve to the betterment, because you're using your audience to actually help you frame out what matters and what they care about. And you can the more you do that, the less time you're going to spend on it. So that instead of spending a full week before a quarterly board meeting trying to hand stitch a board deck together, this thing is natural. It's just, you're just asking for the thing that's always being produced anyway. And you don't have to overthink it.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think, talking to a lot of management teams out there, I get the sense that some of them have differing views of how they consider the experience of a board meeting. And it ranges from fairly negative to let's just survive this thing and get through it and then get back to the business of running the company. And then on the other end of the spectrum, which I think is the healthier perspective, is this is our board. Yes, they're going to govern us, but we're here to use them to advance our agenda. And so how do we get advanced communication and a board deck created so that the baseline is fully set? And then we can spend what I'm guessing is a majority of the board time unpacking some of these challenges and issues and having a constructive problem-solving discussion.
I think that's spot on. One of the things that I see, especially with first-time CEOs and first-time CFOs, is a psychology of, I've got this, I can do it on my own. And I think there needs to be a recognition that probably in most private equity owned businesses, your most expensive human resource, to be honest, is probably the private equity firm, because you're paying outside advisor fees. You're going to be paying a management fee to the private equity firm. And if they've got a consulting organization that's helping you with HR or finance, you're going to be paying consulting fees on that. And I think the fallacy that most first-time CEOs and CFOs have is the board needs to see that we're competent to do this on our own. And that's a totally wrong perspective. The board wants to see that you're willing to leverage every available resource that's made available to you. And a lot of times those associates they're not board members, but they're part of the software group. These are some of the best people ever. Also, all of your outside advisors are people that you should be leveraging to preview parts of the deck with, right? If you know that you've got an outside advisor that's going to go deep on the technology section, take 20 minutes before the board update and walk them through that. You'll already know where the deep dive is going to happen, so that, it doesn't happen in the board meeting. You've already handled that conversation ahead of time. You're leveraging your resources in a better way. And I do think you're right. I think too many leadership teams get focused on, well, I just got to survive the board meeting. I just got to try to put together what they're going to like. And, and then I can get through that, as opposed to leverage the board to help you build it the right way. Actually take their time, steal their time, use them until they tell you to stop, and that you're consuming too much of the time.
Yeah, great stuff. I want to circle back to something you put in a parking lot earlier, which is this idea that they're going to be crunching numbers beforehand. Tell us more about that.
Yeah. So, one of the things that, will always happen, and why a board deck should be, at least sent with all of its supporting material 48 hours in advance, is they literally will take all of that material. So the deck and all the supporting spreadsheets, the appendices, and those associates that are in the software group, they're literally going to run those through their machinery, their modeling, and they're going to line up that modeling against what they actually presented to their IC committee. And they're going to start finding out where there are gaps. And that's going to start driving a lot of that conversation, which is why I think it's important, as you're putting together your material, you should be anticipating where the hard questions are going to be, or what the questions are going to be. And you might not be able to do that the first couple of times you present, because you just don't know yet. But you should be getting a lot better and a lot crisper on this, because they're not just picking up that material and flipping sides. I mean, they are literally running them through their own models most of the time in order to understand it better. And they are walking in fully briefed. So the MD, the partner, the principal, myself, they're walking in fully briefed on everything that's out of alignment from what we expected. And that's going to be super important, because, you're not going to be able to kind of work around or be, not be fully transparent. They're going to find it. Like, if there's an issue in the business, they're absolutely going to find it. They will find the math mistakes that are in the deck. I mean, they'll find basically all of it, because they just are such good consumers of data and models. And that's where, the CEO and the CFO, and then even the CRO on the go-to-market stuff, they've got to become really good presenters of data and builders of models.
Yeah, you're never going to outmodel your private equity sponsor.
Never.
In 99.9% of all cases. And this is a topic for a different day, but yeah, the skill of building and taking the data and turning that into an informative narrative that is effective and transparent is certainly key. So just a couple more questions, and then we'll let you get back to your busy day. Now that sort of post-COVID, we're back to traveling for a fair number of board meetings.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for management during the board dinner, outside of socializing and rapport building and relationship building? How much, if any, should you get into previewing or company performance type information versus a little bit more on the interpersonal side?
Yeah, I think it's super important on the interpersonal side. You want to always get that in there. You want to get to know your board member a little bit better. At the same time, you got to, there's two things that I always advise. One is, don't turn your board dinner into a gripe session, because you're only going to be really talking to maybe one or two board members, because the room or the tables, are so large and loud, and you want to make sure that if you've got an issue that you're talking about, or if the board member asks you a question, right, that you're being transparent and factual, right? And it's got to be less about your opinions and just more about what they're going to see tomorrow. That they're going to hear this tomorrow, they're going to see this tomorrow. Where I've seen fatal mistakes made, to be honest with you, are where at the board dinner, lots of issues are brought up in little micro conversations, and those things never show up in the actual board material or the board conversation. And now you've got a disconnect, because you've got parts of your leadership team that are bringing issues to light that aren't actually going to see the light of the board. That's another reason I'll circle all the way back to the reason that an MOR is so successful. Those things come out there. They're allowed to be brought out in the safety of a leadership team, where they can be raised and they can be talked about and they can be ironed out. And then it can be decided whether or not that's a board level issue that needs to actually be brought to the board and talked about. so that there's agreement right before you ever get into just a board dinner on, we're not, there shouldn't be any, like we've talked about, there shouldn't be any surprises at the board dinner either, right? So right, you don't want your board member getting a whole bunch of things or commentary that they're not aware of. And so you got to be really careful with that. And I think that, that comes to, if as you as a CEO, are you building cohesion in your leadership team? Do they trust each other? Do they have each other's backs? Do they truly, do you guys all align on the critical business issues that are going to be presented at a board level? So I do think it's, it's important that, when a board asks a question, you got to be transparent. Don't hide anything. But at the same time, got to stay focused on what really matters and not bring things up that you've agreed as a leadership team that you're not going to take that to the board because you've got it managed and you've got it handled.
Yeah, it's you mentioned earlier, facts are greater than your opinion, and human nature, among other things, is a neediness or a temptation to blame or complain. And if it's not constructive, it's not going to be well received by your stakeholders. So last question before we go to final thoughts. When executive session unfolds, what does the CEO and management need to understand what goes on in those conversations, once they leave the room?
Yeah. So it's funny because I think that's everybody's scared and worried about that. And honestly, there's going to be multiple things that we talk about. One is, if there's a team assessment, like how'd the team do? And when we're assessing that, it's, how was their board presence? Like, did they have a good board demeanor? More importantly, though, is did they really understand their part of the business? Did they focus in on the metrics that mattered? Did they focus in on aligning their current performance or their part of the business's current performance to board expectations? Did they focus too much time on what they're doing and how busy they are, right? That'll come up. And then honestly, we'll spend time ourselves talking about the key issues within the business. If we're missing go-to-market, or if we're missing product delivery, or if we've got product stability issues or customer churn issues, we're going to talk about those as a board and identify who on the board could we put to lean in the business, right, to help, right? Because at the end of the day, everybody on the board and everybody on the leadership team should have the same final goal outcome, which is to maximize the return, right? That's what we're all trying to do, right? So we're not trying to do, when I come in from a board perspective, I'm not trying to do anybody's job. I'm just going to try to help that person do their job a little bit better, right? Because we all want the exact same outcome. We all are looking to do wealth creation. And right. And that goes all the way from the leadership team to the board, right, to the partners that are a part of the fund, all the way up to the LPs. Everybody's got that same goal, and making sure that we have that alignment. So when we're in that executive session, that's what we're talking about. Like, what can we do to get the business back onto, right, the railroad track that we thought we had bought it and put it on. And if there are things we think we can lean in and do, then that's what we want to do.
Boy, that word alignment is core to what private equity is all about. And yet it's so much more than a high level concept, and has a real art and science to it that is a never ending task to make sure.
Right.
I think of the analogy of the airplane that spends 1% of its time exactly on course, and the other 99% fighting turbulence, wind, and shear, and other effects. Jeff, this has been awesome. Any final thoughts before we wrap up today?
No, I think that one, you said it. I think when you're in the CEO seat or the CFO seat, I think you want to enjoy it. I think you want to figure out how to enjoy what you're doing, how to enjoy building your team, enjoy learning how to build a repeatable board package that speaks for itself, that allows, right, you to present the business in, the right and appropriate light. But make it enjoyable. Find ways to, bring humor into what you're doing. Because if it's a slog, it'll always be a slog. So I just, the biggest encouragement I have is make sure you're enjoying what you're doing. And if you are, right, things are gonna, you'll find ways to make it easier.
Yeah, well said, because I think when that angst is there, even if you think it's below the surface, your audience is picking up on that, and
Yep,
that can also erode confidence. So,
absolutely right.
okay, well, Jeff, thank you again for a killer discussion. Out of respect for your time, I'm going to wrap up now, despite the temptation to keep going. But thanks again, and we'll see you soon.
It was a great pleasure. Thanks a lot, Rob.
Okay, thank you.
Take care.